following your work through all your different stops, 538, latest Sports Illustrated, and we got this book to talk about Blood in the Garden, the 90s Knicks. And this book, before we get into it here, is I didn't live this, like I did. I was born in 1998, so I didn't watch games like The Last Dance for me. It's like during the pandemic, first real time going back and watching that. Like you'll catch a game here or there on hardwood classics, and you'll watch some highlights and this and that, but you don't really get a sense of what it was like to live it until you dive into a book like this or a documentary or something of the sort. So I think you talked about it a little bit in the back end of the book there, but what was kind of your inspiration to dive into this story in particular?
I mean, I wish I had like a beautiful poetic story, and maybe there's some aspects of that within, how I got to do this. But honestly, someone asked me to.
Yeah.
I covered the Knicks from 2012 to 2016, and for better or worse, developed a reputation as a different sort of writer. Um, and so that reputation kind of got passed along to someone that is a book agent that was looking for a literary agent that was trying to find an author to write a book about those teams. I'm like you. I wasn't not quite as young as you are, but was not old enough to have watched those teams, to have understood those teams like you would, watch the occasional game on NBA TV or something like that, and maybe watch YouTube clips here and there. But I wasn't someone who, I'm 35, which probably sounds old to you, but makes me 4 years old. I would have been 4 years old when they hired Pat Riley. And by the time they were done with that era, okay, from the way I wrote this book, I was maybe 12. So I wasn't paying attention. Like I was a Bulls fan, but even with that, like I caught the very end of Jordan's career to where I actually could understand it and could realize like, wow, Michael Jordan's way better than anybody else in the sport. That was about all I understood. I never watched any of their playoff series with the Knicks or anything like that. I wasn't old enough to have really understood it that way. And even with that, people are like, oh, so you being a Bulls fan, like, was your impetus for doing it to cover the other side of it? Not even. Like, I just wasn't. I as soon as they left, as soon as Michael Jordan left and decided to retire, my fandom kind of died with it too. The team was horrible. They went and kind of got high schoolers. So I really didn't understand anything about that era. It was strictly like research and reporting that kind of got me to understood it, because watching it here and there is not really going to give you enough of an understanding unless you watch a lot of those games. And quite frankly, you'll probably hurt your eyes if you watch a lot of those games. So yeah,
So
I figured, go ahead.
was that the first step for you, kind of going back and watching those games and kind of figuring out like, all right, these are going to be the key points in the story here?
No, no, no. Honestly, for me, it was interviewing people that were part of those teams, not the key people. Like the way I kind of reverse engineered all this, I figured talk to the guys that were there but not focal points of those times, to get a sense of what they remember about those practices. I started the book, from the 1991-92 season when they hired Riley, and the whole reason I did that was because they immediately went through a cultural shift when he got the job. He took them from being a team that was kind of not that physical, not that interesting, not that good, to being a team that instantly, was in competition with the Celtics for first place in the Atlantic, or whatever the division was called at the time. I can't remember. And a team that 3 years in a row was the best defense in the league. He built an identity around toughness. So I wanted to talk to people who would have remembered every detail of it, about what it was like to have Pat Riley come in after years of the Knicks not being relevant, basically, about, Patrick Ewing wanting to be traded at a time where Pat Riley was coming in because the team was so irrelevant. So it was talking to not the Ewings and the Starkses and the Oakleys and people like that. It was talking to the Patrick Eddies and, quite frankly, like the Gerald Wilkins and people like that, who were there before Pat Riley, and then were there when Pat Riley got there, and recognized immediately from the first practice how different he would be as a coach. And talking to them, because you can watch it, but what takeaway am I going to have from watching it other than, man, these guys were really physical? Like we can see that, I wanted to be able to tell the stories behind it and the stories that weren't known. I feel like that's where you really get your bang for your buck when you read a book, and to understand those things with better context, not just the images, but also the stories that go behind them.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things you do in here is you kind of what was happening during that time in a moment. And I don't even know how you got some of these stories. Like I wrote some down here. There was one of Ellie's name still being on like the film controller after he left the team at that point, and just kind of like his impact being left on the team even after he was gone. There was one about Don Nelson falling asleep on the plane and just sort of how that like was emblematic of how like he had just didn't have a touch going on in the team, and he was in this like 8 hour slumber through the whole flight. And I think another one similar to that was Riley going down to the club in Miami, going here, I'm not desperate, and he just kind of encapsulated like how strong of a bargaining hand he had at the time, trying to like get like every last sent out, and then ultimately getting this massive compensation to go to the Heat at the time. So there's just all these little stories. I think another one was John Starks getting he's growing up. I'm like, how do you even get all this stuff? So like those little details seem to be like key to how you were trying to tell the story. And I want to kind of get like an insider look at, how like the name on the controller, like how do you even get something like that?
Man, it's a lot of research, which probably sounds like, well, of course it's a lot of research, but it's again, and I think this was part of the reason that my literary agent Daniel Greenberg asked me to do the book specifically, is that I was, I'm not going to take for granted that I just remember anything. I think so, there were some reporters from that era that still cover the league now, and guys that have really, really prominent positions. Frank Isola is someone that has, a Sirius XM show, and someone that has been on Around the Horn for years, and someone that does the Nets telecast in the studio. He co-wrote a book during that era in the late 90s with a guy named Mike Wise that wrote for the New York Times. But I think there was a reason that this literary agent reached out to me specifically. I think when I told him how young I was, I think that was a plus for him, because when he asked me about it, he was like, well, I like that you're younger because you're not going to just assume that you can remember everything from when you covered it. There are a lot of details that you just have to go and really read through LexisNexis and these other massive subscription search sites, where you're going to have to go back and look at tens of thousands of articles and read back through tens of thousands of articles to go get details. Details like the fact that when Patrick Ewing broke his wrist, that he wore a cast and he needed help from Charles Oakley to tie his ties for him to sit out on the bench during those games. Like, it's just a small detail, but and it's like reading through every single story that was written about the Knicks, essentially, I would say from like 87 to about 2000, 2001. And that was what I did. Now, let me not take full credit for it. I did at one point hire a researcher to help me with some of it, but by the time I hired him, I'd already done half of the research for those years that I just mentioned to you. So I did 5 or 6 years worth of research every day, every game they played, every off day they had, the summer, everything like that. Reading through every book that was written that touched on the Knicks even briefly about the 90s. So the Jordan rules, obviously the documentaries that have been done, The Last Dance I watched like everybody else, but reading all those books, reading Reggie Miller's book, reading Doc Rivers wrote a book during those years, I think in 1993, right after the Charles Smith thing. Everybody that had a book, every story that was written, every magazine story, getting old copies of the magazines that the Knicks were featured in or stories that were written about them, and literally highlighting every detail that in any way is interesting. If Anthony Bonner's mouth was bloody from a practice because he got elbowed, I was marking that down. And I think I did utilize a detail like that. Just anything and everything, because you're not sure what will be useful or when it will be useful when you're trying to tell these guys stories. And so that was the aim, was just to have thousands of details at my disposal to be able to utilize. You mentioned John Starks and getting lost on the bus. He had a book that he wrote. I'm sure very few people read it, but he wrote a book in the early mid 2000s, whenever it was, that he co-wrote with someone, and there was a detail in there about the time he got in trouble in school and then got sent home from school. So little details like that, and I think my point with trying to tell his story and Oakley's story about his grandfather and helping in the crops in Alabama and everything else. The point was always to showcase that these guys didn't just have their biggest moments or their best games or their most memorable instances without any context. Those things happen, and we're like, oh God, how crazy is it that this happened? John Starks with his dunk on the Bulls, for instance. But he always was trying to dunk on people. He tried to dunk on Patrick Ewing in his very first training camp with the Knicks on a day where he was probably going to be cut. And so there was that. The idea of him being hot and cold, he literally had a game the day of his wedding that he just kind of got dressed up for at the last minute because he thought that there was no game that day, and came back and had a 22-point half after getting to the game at halftime 3 hours away, after he got ticketed for speeding because he was in such a rush to get there in a totally different state. So, the point was to try to tell these guys stories through the fact that nothing happened in a vacuum. There was always previous context or pretext to all of this. Charles Smith and the constant misses at the rim. There was a whole backstory and a context for that, and I even opened the chapter that way, and as I introduced him. So that was the point of doing so much research, and that was how I did the research, was just literally putting together a calendar of basically 10 years and marking down every day what happened, what was said, what funny thing happened here on this day. It might not have any relevance to that game, but it might have really important context for something else down the line that could be valuable somewhere.
Yeah, and I think especially in the later stages of the book, you start to get a feel for why things are with the Knicks today the way they are, especially related to Dolan rising to power. And we'll circle back on some of that stuff, but we go to the Knicks in 2022 today. They're one of the bigger teams in the headlines this week. It's crazy, the Charlie Ward curse, which you kind of outlined in the book there. Going back to '94 draft, they hadn't had a second contract with a player that they drafted since him, and that came to an end this week. And that story was getting tossed around again, of how long it's been since they've had a rookie stick around with the team like he did. And that's RJ Barrett getting extended. I think 120-ish million. And his name had been floating in the Donovan Mitchell talks. Mitchell's still out there in the September. I know today was the 5-year anniversary of the Kyrie trade, and that was like the latest big story into the offseason that I remember. Maybe Mitchell will get traded this late in the game. Maybe he'll start the season with the Jazz, but it feels like the Knicks are that team that are most talked about when it comes to him ending up on a new spot. It seems like they've been fixated on him, but they're holding out to not try to do the Knicks thing. Like they're not trying to give up 10 first-round picks and Barrett and this and that. But they were like, it doesn't seem like he's going to end up anywhere else but New York at the end of the day. So what's your take on this whole Mitchell saga? Everyone's talked about Rudy and the price that's set. I think people have debated like how much value Mitchell has as a franchise player, but the Knicks are always going to be looking for that star. And he's certainly a guy that would raise their profile as a franchise. And that seems like the kind of thing they would want to do. Where do you ultimately see this whole thing going?
I wish I knew, Bobby. I mean, it's like you said, it seems like something will happen, just because if not, what was the point of all this for several months? But neither team, I would imagine, wants to force a situation that's going to put them in a bad spot. If you're Utah, you could look at it and say, well, if you've still got Donovan Mitchell on your roster, that's bad, because you're obviously trying to reset your team and to put yourself in a position to be in a conversation for the number one pick. I do think that it maybe is something to be said for the fact that losing Rudy Gobert on a team that was already really horrendous outside of Gobert defensively now would be more horrendous or really bad. And that Mitchell helps because obviously is a very good scorer, but that he might not be enough of like a regular season winner in terms of the impact that he makes. I think Gobert actually probably has a bigger impact on them winning games during the regular season. You look at Mitchell's numbers in the clutch and stuff like that. It's basically among the worst in the league among volume shooters in terms of his true shooting percentage and different things like that. So Utah could probably still lose a lot of games with Donovan Mitchell there, but I would imagine that they would like to really solidify that and just totally reset it. Also, at this point, got Mitchell 85% of the way traded, basically. You've got a new coach coming in. You want to just reset things for him as well, I would imagine, to let the coach start with a clean slate and kind of a new set of guys. So I imagine Utah really wants to get this done. I imagine that the Knicks really want to get it done for the same reasons. They've had their guys in trade conversations. You want to lift that burden off of them at some point to either trade them or not trade them. The Knicks, like you said, it's New York. They always want that star. And you hit the nail on the head. Like, how many picks are you giving up? I think that was why RJ was included in the conversation to begin with, is that the Knicks would really prefer not to give up 5-6 picks to get this man. If you can give up RJ and maybe get 2 picks instead, I think that's what they were aiming for. It'll be interesting to see ultimately what the compensation is. I would imagine they're going to have to give up something they really would prefer not to, whether it's the picks, whether it's Quentin Grimes, who's a good young defender and projects as a really good 3-and-D sort of player that any team would really like to have. But we'll see. I think something will get done. I imagine they'll probably end up giving up about 5 picks to do it. They'll probably end up giving up a player or 2 that Knicks fans really like. That's the way trades work when you're trading for a 25, 26-year-old all-star. You're going to give up something that you'd prefer to keep, but also it's Donovan Mitchell, who's not a great player, but I think is a very good player. And you're going to have to give up something good to get him in his prime.
Yeah, sense, because they're in a weird spot where they have all those young players you mentioned. I like all of them. Quickly, Grimes, McBride. I think he's had some impressive at this point, but they didn't play those guys. And you know how Thibodeau is with his rotations and all that. 2 years ago, he comes in, coach of the year. They're that top defense again. They sort of have that identity back in them, and Julius Randle has this resurgence and becomes a star. There's this real buzz in the Garden. Like you said, you just know that fervor that's in the building when that team's good and when they matter, and that carries over in the next year. And Kemba arrives, and everyone's excited about him in New York, and it feels like they're going to keep that momentum going. And then they just have this disaster season, and yeah, the young guys really didn't take any steps. They missed the playoffs. It's sort of just a disastrous outcome last year. And you get Brunson, that's awesome. I don't feel like there was a huge amount of excitement and hype over that addition, even though it's a pretty good one on the floor. But Mitchell is the kind of guy that would move a needle in that sense, as a star. And, you wrote about them saying they didn't take any questions on it. For what reason, who knows? But it's a weird spot to be in, right? Because they could kind of take the slow road right now through these young guys and draft players. They didn't do that in this last draft. They traded all those picks and cleared all the space. And Mitchell, he's going to move the needle somewhat, and that might be a path to more stars coming in down the line. But in this stacked East, is Brunson, is Mitchell, and whatever else they have after that trade's done enough to even get into a play-in spot at that point? I think that's up in the air, especially on the D4. Brunson and Mitchell, that'd be powerful offensively, but they might still have all these defensive issues they had last year, even though it's much more power in the backcourt. So I think this team's in just such a weird spot. It feels like they have to do this just to get the needle pointing in the right direction, but I don't know if the outcome will be much better than it's been over the last 2 years, even though they have the star power at that point.
It's weird. I was saying this yesterday to somebody. It's weird on a lot of different levels. I can't remember the last time a team really considered or offered essentially their best young player for another star. And granted, I understand RJ hasn't been an all-star before, so I'm using the word star relatively speaking, but obviously you don't get $100 million contracts if you're not a star on some level, or you're not expected to be one. So,
and his production's been there. Yeah. Stat
right.
wise.
I mean, he's a 20 point per game guy. He just turned 22. So he's a young player that still has plenty of room to grow. But what's so strange about it, though, is so you're trying to tap into your youth movement here, but at the same time, you just offered RJ in a trade, in trade proposals to get the guy that you want. You didn't end up trading RJ as part of the package that you might inevitably end up using. You instead extended him, but you just paid him pretty handsomely. And the whole reason that you were offering to trade him specifically is because you didn't want to have to use this bevy of picks that you've got, or at least not all of them. So now if you get Mitchell, the assumption, because Barrett probably won't be part of the deal, is that you are going to use the majority of your picks to get him, which then means you're not going to have a huge number of picks left over to get another star, which it still feels like they would be one more guy away, quite frankly.
Yeah.
I agree with you on that. I agree with you that defensively there are going to be some questions. I think Brunson's a little bit better than he gets credit for defensively. He takes charges. He gets around screens. He's a little bit of like a bulldog. He's not Kyle Lowry or Fred VanVleet or anything, but he is like tougher than he's given credit for.
And Mitchell was better. Like, I don't know what happened to Mitchell on that end last year. It was
Shouldn't
never
have
a
been nearly as bad
disaster.
as he was. It should
Yeah.
not have been nearly that bad. He's got a big wingspan for someone his size, for his height, because he's only 6'1". I don't think anyone thinks of him as being only 6'1", but last year was just really, really bad, particularly in the playoffs. Particularly, and it's kind of ironic. I was reading that Dan Devine wrote from The Ringer, and he was kind of talking about how Donovan Mitchell, his coming out party, from a postseason standpoint, was playing against Carmelo several years ago when Carmelo was they were constantly targeting Carmelo and bringing him into pick and rolls and switching to get him into pick and rolls so that Donovan Mitchell could just kind of fry him up. And that's essentially what Dallas was doing to Donovan Mitchell last year. In some cases, it was Brunson doing it to him. So, and again, that was with Rudy Gobert as his backstop. So the idea now that you wouldn't be concerned about that. I will say the Knicks, even last year, having taken a step back, were still a pretty good defensive team. Tom Thibodeau's teams generally always are. But you don't really have like a stopper in that lineup. You don't really have like a 3-point specialist in that lineup. And you have a really small backcourt on top of the fact that you don't really have a stopper. If anybody, you would hope RJ can do that, but that's not what he's known for. Like, he's a perfectly good defender, okay defender. But also the other thing from RJ's perspective, as I was saying before, you really are paying him to be one of your stars now. But if you've got Brunson handling the ball and Mitchell handling the ball, and frankly, Randle had a higher usage rate than RJ did last year, is RJ your fourth option? And are you really expecting him to make like a star leap within the fact that he's going to be someone that's not possessing the ball a whole lot? Like, so there are a lot of questions. I completely agree with you. I just wrote a story to that effect. It'll be up probably in the next hour or two, asking some of these same questions. I don't know how close it puts them to being a contender. I think they probably would make the playoffs somehow. I would not expect them to be a contender for anything serious, even with Mitchell. But part of it is just that Mitchell is not a completely well-rounded player. He's grown as a playmaker a little bit. He can become a little tunnel vision sometimes. But the biggest question is defense, particularly a team that at its best a couple of years ago, they were, one of the best defensive teams in the league. And I just think it's tougher to be that way when you are a team that has a backcourt with two guys starting at 6'1", one of whom is one of the worst defenders in the league. At least last year he was. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to see whether they can hold on to Grimes, because the last thing you want to do is give up someone that actually does defend on a team where you really don't have many guys that are known for that. So it'll be interesting to watch for sure. And it'll also be interesting to see, as we were saying before about Thibodeau, a guy that does not like to play a whole lot of young players, what happens this year, in a year where if they don't do well and they do go out and spend whatever they need to spend to get Donovan Mitchell, what happens with the expectations for this team, and how does that play into what happens with Tom Thibodeau, who was only 1 year removed from winning Coach of the Year, but I imagine, could find himself on the outs if the team does not make the playoffs next year after they've gotten Donovan Mitchell and Jalen Brunson.
Oh, that'd be crazy to think about. And you mentioned a lot of good points on Barrett. I like the idea of calling him a star because he's had that pedigree. I want to say off the top of my head, he was the top player in that draft class out of high school.
Yeah,
and then Zion overtook him after that. And I remember there was a game I was covering Syracuse at the time, and it was right after Zion hurt his foot. So he didn't play in that Duke-Syracuse game, and it was just RJ coming up essentially. So there wasn't really the allure around the game that there would have been with Zion. But Barrett just put on a clinic in terms of having the ball in his hands, making all the right decisions, getting downhill, scoring at will. He just put on this maestro performance with the ball in his hands. And we haven't seen a ton of that. As you said, Randle being there in New York. Barrett's shot isn't the best, so having him off ball as a catch and shoot guy probably isn't the best usage of him, and maybe that further pigeonholes him in that role at that point. And then, is he offered in this trade? Like, I don't love the idea of that, giving up him, because he should be the centerpiece here. Even if Mitchell comes in, even if you still have Randle, like, you want your young player to grow and evolve to something bigger, especially as young as he is. And all this different stuff that's happening around him seems to have prevented that. And maybe going in this direction makes it even harder, because like, I was at that game where he hit the game winner against the Celtics when they blew the 25-point lead.
Oh, wow.
And, he didn't have the best game, but he has that great moment, and you think he's going to build off that, but he's just had all these ups and downs, and you almost wonder if this is going to be the place where he thrives. It's going to have to be now, because he signs this extension, and he's not going to be part of this trade here. But man, it just feels like it's been tough for him. And we talk about that word drought coming to an end. It almost doesn't feel like it's that kind of moment. Like, they're really committing and investing in this player into the next deal. They are money-wise, but are they actually on the court here? It doesn't seem like it. And he's just in a tough place, it feels like. Maybe the team will have a higher profile and everybody succeeds because of that. But I agree with you 100%. He should have the ball in his hands and grow in that. Look at Jason Tatum in Boston. I feel like he was almost in a similar spot to Barrett in terms of his role and what he was doing early in his career. And then when he gets the ball in his hands in 2020, the game changes, and he's all of a sudden a top 10, 15 player.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be a big question going forward. I mean, RJ's had nice stretches, and really, I think he's been a victim a little bit of a couple things. I think one, the guys in his class, the two guys that were taken ahead of him, in Ja, obviously, this past year, even having missed all the games he missed, and Zion, even having missed the whole season. Zion, has stretches where he's averaging 30 a game, and it basically looks like the next coming of like a Shaq Giannis hybrid, as far as just how powerful he is when he's healthy, as far as what he does in the paint. I don't know that that's fair to hold that against RJ, because he's not that. Like, he doesn't have to be a superstar to be worth the contract he just got. At the same time, as we both are saying, there's a big gap between that and, like, it's not to be to use a hyperbole, but the idea that he really is like a 3.5 or like fourth option within the way that this team could work, as far as who's going to have the ball in their hands. Like, are you going to run a lot of pick and rolls for him? Is he going to be the one using the pick and roll a lot? Mitchell Robinson could potentially kind of be more involved in a lot of that. He will be, as the role man with a lot of situations. So he's going to kind of, my suggestion within the story that I'm going to have up soon at SI is the idea of like letting him run a lot with the second unit, to at least give him more reps that way, to make sure that he's not just lost in the shuffle. I don't think it's a good use of him to just have him be a spot up guy, although I think getting easier looks for him would be nice. Keep in mind the Knicks have had, a pretty beaten down Kemba as their point guard. And then when they went away from that, they started using Alec Burks, who's not a natural
They
point
haven't
guard.
had a point guard in a long, like, who was their last great point guard?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, they really haven't. That drought is almost as long as the one as the Charlie Ward one. In all seriousness, they had Chauncey and they had the Jeremy Lin stretch and different stuff. So they've had moments here and there. Raymond Felton had a nice year. They had that one year where they made the playoffs in 12-13, where they had Felton and Jason Kidd and Pablo Prigionis come off the bench, where they had good guard play generally, but they've never had like a star guard. You've really got to go back to like the Marbury years, where there was even a perception that they might have a guy like that, which is pretty rough. So anyway, thinking about all that, like, he hasn't been put in a good position where other guys can set him up well, which is why I think Brunson's helpful. But you can be happy with the Brunson acquisition without saying, oh, we need to get Donovan Mitchell right now. Because if you're hoping that RJ can develop into some of what you're thinking or hoping, I would just imagine that Mitchell eclipses some of that. And then obviously you brought up a really good point. If they're going to be a winning team, it may not matter as much. Like, that's the priority. It's not about maximizing RJ's stats. It may not even be about maximizing his potential necessarily. If the team wins, you need that to be the case more than anything else if you're the Knicks. But I do wonder, especially within his contract incentives and his escalators and his contract, his salary, he will get the full 120 if he makes all-star teams, if he makes all league teams and all NBA teams, stuff like that. I would imagine that that's easier to do when you get more scoring opportunities. But I also would imagine that it's more likely that he makes those teams and makes the All-Star team if the Knicks are good. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's still so early for him that I could imagine any number of things happening. But it's not lost on me that it's a little bit strange that he's getting more of a star turn here contract-wise, but is going to probably have the ball less than he has in the last couple of years. We'll see. We'll see how it plays out. We'll see if they even get Mitchell. It might be a moot point. We might be jumping the gun with a lot of this, but it's all very strange. And yeah, I see somebody in the chat who just said he averaged 26 the last part of the season. You're right. From the All-Star game on, when he came back from an injury, to I think it was a 14-game stretch, he averaged 26 and a half. And he did it on not the greatest efficiency, but he was getting to the line more. He was more aggressive. He was finishing with his right on the right side of the basket a lot more often. So he's shown more of a comfort level. He gets out in transition. There's a lot of different things that he can do. Never been the most efficient. And that's what you're hoping here, is that some of these guys make his looks a little bit easier. You're able to give him less defensive attention by having a guy like Donovan and a guy like Jalen. So we'll see what happens. He's capable. But I do wonder to some extent, like with how inconsistent he's been, does he need the ball more to get into a better rhythm? And if he does, then maybe this stuff isn't as helpful for him as the Knicks are hoping.
Well, what we're still trying to get a grasp of too, I feel, to some degree with the league now, is he's 22. Like,
Yep.
you discover these guys' names when they're in high school at this point, and then you see them in college for a year, whatever they do, and then they're in the league for a couple of years, and it's almost like those first 2 or 3 years in the league are what college would have been for guys at one point in their career, because they're not even hitting the age certain guys get into the league in until they're like almost into their second contract, like he is. So like Tatum went through that too. He's just hitting 24 now. These guys are in like the early stages of their careers, even, as we get to know their names for 3 or 4 years here. So he has a lot of upside to go. The name we didn't even address all that much here is Randle. And that's a weird situation in itself. Like, you covered the fan base, and there was a real nasty back and forth between him and the crowd and everything else last year. And it almost seemed like his time was up there, but they committed to him. Seemed like they really liked him as a centerpiece after that All-NBA season. And now he's just sort of there because they couldn't get rid of him. And I like his game. It feels like there's a chance for him to bounce back. And, if he tightens up defensively and they're more connected on that end, maybe he'll flow into more opportunities from on the offensive end of the floor. But he's the forgotten name there right now, it feels like, because he just had this really strange 22 that was pretty emblematic of how the year went for them as a whole. And I don't know what's next for him, especially if Mitchell comes.
Yeah, I mean, that was one. I have a co-host on my podcast at SI. Our SI podcast is called Open Floor. And Michael Pina, who is a Celtics fan, but also a really, really good analyst around the league, he had shouted until the cows came home about the idea that he felt like a Julius Randle regression was on the way. He was not alone in that regard. Zach Lowe, any number of other people that I really respect in the industry were kind of forecasting that they thought that was on the way, because Randle had been, a pretty bad volume 3-point shooter for his whole career up until the year before last. Then he shoots closer to 40%. Everybody's wondering where that came from. By the way, the Knicks had, I think, 4 of the 12 or 13 guys with the highest, biggest 3-point percentage improvement. It was like Randle, Barrett, Bullock, and Derrick Rose all shot way above their career averages from 3 that particular season. And so the Knicks were a sexy pick for a lot of people to regress as a team. And obviously that did happen. I think there were other things that went into it as well. They made a big bet on Kemba Walker. They also made a big bet on Fournier as well. And naturally those guys are going to take something out of your defense. Kemba really threw off their guard rotation the entire
It's
season.
amazing that they gave Kemba 2 years after watching what he did in Boston. Did they even watch Boston?
And you all would have seen it firsthand. And that was something that Michael pointed out to me. He was like, my first hunch that maybe it wouldn't be like the match made in heaven that I think the Knicks hoped it would be, I reference this a lot, was that when they had Kemba's introductory press conference, which was a big deal, obviously, because he's from New York and going home and different stuff like that. But when they introduced him and Mark Berman of the New York Post asked Kemba, um, what do you make of how you're going to be used this year? Do you assume that you're going to play back to backs? Are you going to sit those out like you did with Boston? Like, what do you see on the horizon for you? And he was like, oh, like you'd have to ask coach. Like, that's going to be up to him. And Thibodeau was sitting in the front row of the press conference. He was like, he's playing.
Yeah.
And, he laughed and everybody else laughed. But since when has Tom Thibodeau ever like joked about not using someone or not playing someone as much as he possibly could? So Kemba was playing every day. There was a reason Boston didn't do that when he was there. And it resulted in Kemba, like, look at his game logs from last year and you see it where
he had a few monster stretches.
Virtually every time he was thrown back in the mix, including after that long stretch where they had pulled it. Remember, they pulled him out of the rotation at one point, and then they had to put him back in because of COVID and everything. And he went off for like 2-3 games. But what always happened, it was like watching an hourglass and essentially watching the sand run out quicker and quicker. Like his tank would just empty faster. It's not that he's old. He's a relatively young guy, not a young NBA player, but like a relatively young guy. The bigger challenge is just that like his knees aren't there, and he's never really been a good defender. Rarely has he been as bad as he's been the last couple of years. But obviously, like when you invest in Kemba, not just 1 year but 2 years, not huge money, but invested him at all, and you make him your starting point guard, and you plan around that, you bank on that. It falters, particularly when Derrick Rose is not healthy, particularly when Tom Thibodeau refuses to use Miles McBride. So there's any number of things that were wrong with the team, but it all gets back to what you were saying about Randle and Barrett. These guys end up handling the ball more when those guys are out. So it's kind of a question of, would these guys be unlocked if you had better ball handling? And you'll probably get the answer to that question this year. But also, even as you're unlocking them, are you also taking something away from them by not giving them the ball as much as they would normally have it? You want to have them get easier shots and have setup men for them, but you also don't want to take the ball away from them completely. A lot of Knicks fans would love Randle to have the ball taken away from him completely. They would love if Randle weren't there at all. And that's another question. We haven't even talked about what you got into with the idea of just how, frankly, toxic sometimes it kind of felt between Randle and the fan base. Randle's wife
did the thumb down, right? Or was that?
Yeah, I mean, just I'm not ever going to kind of suggest that someone had other stuff going on in the background, but if that had been the case, it almost would have like made more sense. Like if there had been stuff off the court or whatever, because he just was not coping or dealing very well with how poorly the season was going for him. But it was a massive regression for him. And on some level, like if you had told me or anybody else that the regression was going to be that severe for him specifically, then I would have bet against the Knicks making it. I thought the Knicks would make the playoffs after, having the really good season 2 years ago. If you told me that Randle was going to drop off that hard, because I think most people projected that he would regress a little bit, but if you had told me it was going to be that bad, I would have said off the bat that there's no way they'll make the playoffs if he's four, because they had just thrown him the money and he saw himself as a number one option, and that hurts you too when someone's that inefficient but still forces shots.
That was the swing factor, right? Because you looked at like Kemba and Fournier Celtics backcourt from that awful season the year before, and you knew that was gonna probably not go well, especially on the defensive side of the floor. The Celtics were just dreadful defense.
Again, you guys knew that. You guys knew that having watched.
I didn't know the Randle part though. I was in the same boat as you. I was like, if he sustains, they're gonna be back in the playoffs. But Kemba, it's been sad decline. He went into the whole string of everything that happened there, and I was almost looking back on it, and it goes back to that All-Star game where he played a ton of minutes. People seem to think that's where it went off the rails, surgery. So it was probably inevitable that the cartilage decline and bone on bone and all that stuff wasn't going to be sustainable for him. It's still that joke though. I was searching because Nick Nurse was the coach of that All-Star team. I guess Celtics fans are saying Nick Nurse isn't going to see the pearly gates, and I put that in the bar, and there was like hundreds and hundreds of tweets saying Nick Nurse isn't seeing the pearly gates. I want to talk Dolan. As you get into his rise to becoming ownership in this book, he's been criticized throughout the years for his ownership of this team, and you kind of laid out that first insertion in the basketball side where they fire the GM or Jeff Van Gundy, and that put Checketts in a weird spot. And there's been all these different stories over the years of him intervening, and you cited the whole Charles Oakley incident where he got banned from the Garden and kicked out at that game, and that was just such a weird moment in Knicks history. And I think every Knicks fan wants Dolan's ownership to end. It's gonna anytime soon. But when you look at everything that's gone on since the 90s and even the last couple of years here, how much is it fair to Dolan? And does Dolan deserve as much flack as he gets for his ownership of this team? And you've covered this team too in the recent.
Yeah. I go back and forth on that question. I think absolutely Dolan has inserted himself into a lot of the deal making with this team. Now, I would say more recently, I don't think that's been the case, but even during the time where I was on the team, there were rumors, some like reputable people. One of my coworkers now, Howard Beck, who's well respected throughout the league and it's not known for just publishing fiction, said point blank that the people that he spoke to with the Knicks said that Dolan basically forced the trade that the Knicks made for Andrea Bargnani several years ago when I was on the beat, and that was right on the heels. Like the Knicks had just been the number 2 seed in the East out of nowhere. Carmelo was finishes third in the MVP voting, wins the scoring title. The Knicks lose in what I would just say was a really bad matchup for them against the Pacers. I picked the Pacers to win that series, but the Pacers were a really, really great defensive team that had a really good rim protector, which was part of what the Knicks were always going to struggle against with the way that their team was built that particular year. So most people would take that and look at that and say, let's build on it. The Knicks had broken a record that year for most threes made and attempted in a year. They had kind of tripped onto something that just really worked well, and it was kind of the future of the league with perimeter shooting and playing sometimes 4 and 5 out, using 2 point guards, positionless basketball, Melo at the 4. And then instead, what happens is that the Knicks, their executive, who at the time was Glenn Grunwald, he finishes, I think, third in executive of the year voting. And then he's fired basically on the eve of the preseason of training camp the next year, like literally a couple of months after winning executive of the year. And we were all kind of confused by it. Nobody knew why that was. But then we find out later that either the reason that he's fired or the reason that he's leaving, presumably, is because Dolan forced the Andrea Bargnani trade against Grunwald's wishes. And that makes sense. Like Amari Stoudemire's knees were messed up. He was going to miss the beginning of the season. So the Knicks wanted a replacement for him. And they were interested in Bargnani, kind of kicking the tires on it. But the Knicks, if you remember, gave up, I think, 2 first-round picks. And they gave up Steve Novak, who had, I think, led the league in three-point percentage the prior year and was a huge part of their identity as a team that broke the record for three-point shots and made and attempted in a season. So they traded the focal point of their identity for someone that was like a 29% three-point shooter, 28% three-point shooter the year before that, or whatever he was. It was well below average. Andrea Bargnani's perception as a three-point shooter was much greater than him as an actual three-point shooter and a floor spacer. And it completely tanked the team. And Dolan was the impetus for that. That was also something where I think Andrea Bargnani was represented by CAA, which was in bed with the Knicks a lot during those years. Carmelo Anthony was represented by CAA. Leon Rose, the current GM of the team now, president of the team now, was Carmelo's agent at the time. So there was a lot of weird stuff happening at the time, but Dolan was at the forefront of that. And just like you said before, you started to see remnants of that kind of seeping through in the late 90s when Dolan first became the owner of the team. The first thing he ever got involved with was the idea of the Knicks GM and the Knicks coach during that year, Jeff Van Gundy, getting into kind of a war of words anonymously, sometimes publicly, and Dolan being a media guy and having his family. If you don't know who Dolan is, his father basically founded HBO. So they're tied in with TV and cable and media generally. Dolan came up through the media side, so he was very invested in what the newspapers had to say, what they wrote, how they wrote about his team. And so he really took he paid a lot of attention to that stuff. And so when the Knicks were faltering a little bit with the highest payroll in the league, he essentially demanded that one of the guys be fired, whether it was Ernie Grunfeld or Jeff Van Gundy, even though the team still had a chance to make the playoffs. Like, it was very premature to do that, in my opinion. But he did that, and, essentially orders that they fire the GM. And then what happens after they fire the GM? The Knicks make a miraculous run as the 8th seed to the NBA Finals, and Jim Dolan essentially felt like that validated his choice to have the GM fired. So he kind of felt like he was the smartest guy in the room, and look at what I did, and look, now the team responded because of what I did, and so it kind of set him on a path to consistently get involved in these deals, whether it was a Carmelo trade, whether it was a Bargnani trade, you name it, he was involved in each of those, at least reportedly. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. I don't think he's as involved now. I think he has mostly let the Knicks do what they need to do from a management standpoint. You asked a question I've taken all this time to answer. Do I think he's to blame for all of it? I don't think all of it. I think the bigger problem is just that the Knicks have gone 15, 20 years now without a legitimate star that they've had that was, just within the organization, that was a two-way player. Carmelo was wonderful for them, was great. They had some of his great years, some of his best years. They didn't build the team around him all that well, and they also gave up so much to get him, which maybe you could argue that was Dolan's fault. They gave up so much to get him via trade when they could have maybe just waited till free agency, that it hurt the team in a lot of those ways. But I just think some of it has been bad luck. They've consistently kind of faltered in the lottery. It's kind of incredible that they haven't won a lottery since Patrick Ewing, considering how bad they've been for most of the time. So I just kind of feel like more often than not, teams have good runs and good decades when they've got a superstar, and the Knicks really have not had one. Carmelo's maybe the closest thing they've had to it, and he was not, in my opinion, a full-out superstar. He didn't play both ways. So I think that's the bigger problem. If you want to blame some of that on Dolan, I get it, but I just kind of feel like when the team does well, or if a team does well, the owner, people just kind of forget how bad an owner is. Phoenix is a really good example of that. Their owner is literally under investigation right now.
And the Clippers for all those years.
Right. I mean, they were horrible, and then they get Chris Paul, and they hand Monty Williams the reins. Devin Booker takes a step. Mikal Bridges is who he is. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, wow, like Phoenix is like a model franchise. No, they still have the same owner. So
they just wrote a piece about how they don't care about draft picks. It's like, all right, something's still up in the organization, but
right. So I don't, I tend to think that, yeah, ownership absolutely is a huge competitive advantage. It can be a real hindrance too. I absolutely think it's been a hindrance for the Knicks most of the time, but I also think that Dolan gets blamed for everything all the time, more often than not. And I don't think that's fair, because I do think if the team did get a number one pick and did get a number one pick in the right year, some of that is luck. And I think that sometimes people overlook that. And I also think they overlook the idea of having a superstar or a high level star that makes everybody around them better. And Chris Paul being one of those sorts of guys, and how quickly it kind of just changes the organization, even if it's one that's run by a bad owner.
The book's Blood in the Garden. Go get it wherever you can get your books. Chris, I want to ask you before you get out of here, as you said to start the show, you were kind of coming into this researching, learning about those years, and reading this book. You just, if you're my age or even your age, like, you're learning all this stuff you never knew before, tons of it. The Dolan stuff, how he came into reigns with the teams, one of them. We talked about some of the stuff earlier. I never knew how great John Starks was. I think the book does a great job of outlining that. The Charles Smith ending of that game that you mentioned, I'd seen it, but I never really realized how bad and grueling it was until reading that book. The whole breakup with Pat Riley I thought was really interesting, of course, and then the surgery I thought you went into with great detail as well. So that's like some of the revelations I've had reading the book. For you writing the book, what was your biggest revelation or most interesting thing you learned about that era?
Well, really, I mean, the one that I thought was the biggest takeaway that had not been out there, and even, Spike Lee's going to make a docuseries out of this. He and I've been working together. And then even some of the people that just I interviewed for the book were like, I did not know that. The detail that I had in there that was on that level was about the 94 finals. A guy named Rolando Blackman, who up until Dirk, surpassed him, was the leading scorer in Mavericks history, still number 2 in their franchise history, a 4-time All-Star. He was at the back end of his career when the Knicks acquired him, but he was one of Starks' backups. He was really like their third string shooting guard at that time. Hubert Davis was the backup, the second stringer. But he and Pat Riley had gotten into an argument really one round before the NBA Finals. And Pat Riley was pretty upset with him because Rolando asked if it'd be possible to bring the players' wives down to Houston for the start of the NBA Finals, basically as a mountaintop moment. None of the Knicks players had ever even been to the finals before that. But you have to remember, Riley had been to many. He'd won 4 the decade prior with the Lakers. So he was very anti-women with regards to like them being a distraction. He didn't want anything to distract the players on the biggest stage they'd ever played on. So Riley said no to Rolando. Rolando had asked the question in front of the whole team, right after they beat Indiana in a really emotional Game 7 victory at home at the Garden. So then when Riley said no, Rolando repeated his question and like kind of urged Riley, like, why can we not bring our wives? This is a huge moment for us. These women hold down our families. Like they do everything we ask of them when we're gone all the time. I just think it's kind of unfair to not be able to bring them. So again, Riley just said no. He didn't provide any real explanation. He didn't feel like he had to because Pat Riley was Pat Riley. So Riley was bent out of shape about it, so much so that he actually called the team president after that incident and told him, I need you to stand behind me on this. Like, I don't think the wives should come down to Houston with us. The team president disagreed with him, but he was willing to let Pat set the rules. He had always said that, Pat is the guy that's been to several NBA finals and won a bunch of them. I've never been there. None of us have ever been there. So Pat deserves the right to do what he wants to do. He did tell Pat, if the series goes back to Houston for game 6 and 7, the wives are going to come down. I'm not going to hold them out of this experience entirely just because you feel like it's a distraction. You're a good enough coach. You should be able to avoid distraction with these players. So anyway, all that aside, Rolando Blackman never got into the series. And when you talk about huge faltering moments, John Stark shoots 2 for 18 in that game 7 in 94. And Rolando Blackman, a guy that had historically killed the Rockets, even to where some of the Rockets players told me they were afraid Rolando was going to get into that game 7 because of how much he killed the Rockets. His highest scoring average against any team was against the Rockets. He was in a division against the Rockets, and those guys were terrified of him. The fact that he never got into game 7, despite John Starks missing 11 shots in a row at one point, going 0 for 11 from 3, and the fact that he finished 2 for 18, the fact that Riley never even pulled Starks out for like a minute or two just to give him a breather to calm down. And in the book, I get into it. John Starks was essentially going on no sleep for 3 nights because he was traumatized from the way the game 6 ended. So he basically was an insomniac for the 3 nights before that. The idea that Riley never subbed him out because maybe, I think the bigger reason was just that he trusted Starks, but I think part of it also might have been that Rolando Blackman had frustrated him and angered him a week or 2 before that. So that was something that I never knew. That was something that had not been reported. That was something that even some of the people within the organization didn't know had happened, that they were stunned that Rolando felt like that might have been part of the reason he never got in. And, Riley himself wrote Rolando letters essentially apologizing to Rolando for not having used him in that series.
I was gonna ask about that detail, and Rolando never replied, right?
never responded. And Rolando was like, look, it's not my way of saying that I'm still mad about it. It's just like I don't think anything needs to be said. Like he's apologized. Like they've talked since then. They've just never responded to letters, never written back to letter.
Yeah.
Riley, and the irony is that Riley reached out. I think it was in 2005 that year that the is it 05 or 06 that the Heat won the title with
06.
Wade and Shaq.
Or was it 05? 05, yeah.
Miami and Dallas were playing each other, and Rolando had a role within the Mavericks organization. So I think that was why Pat said something to him, or made a point of making public statements of saying that was the biggest mistake I've ever made as a coach, was not using Rolando. But either way, that to me was a huge revelation that we can question whether or not that was why Riley didn't use him. I don't think it was the key reason, but it could have been a factor, and that's just a huge, colossal sort of error. But it's also, you would know from reading the book, but other people will learn if they read it, that Riley was so big on the idea of either being in with him fully, down to everything he believed, or out, where if you didn't believe in everything he thought, and if you weren't in lockstep with him on everything, that was, that he had no use for you, basically. And that might have been an example of that.
I love the coverage of that finals in the book. There's so much great stuff in here. You even get into the OJ chase, which could be a book on its own, but just had to be like a fiction in here, which I'm sure was something to dive deeper into. But I think it hit the right amount of time in that series, and there's a lot of stuff that happened in that series. Love the book. Go get it. Put in the garden your summer reading this, or your off season, whatever it is, waiting for the NBA to come back. On our side, go check out Athletic Flash Garden for the Garden Report. Get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs when you try out their product and enjoying it for a month or two here. And it's a great way to start your morning. 1 powder, 75 vitamins, minerals, all the good stuff you need for your health, vitamin D, and into the fall for your immune system. athleticgreens.com/garden. Dome Theory, go get it. Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, read Chris Herring, as he said, out on the Knicks and this whole Barrett extension and their future coming on Sports Illustrated. Chris, great to finally have you on, talk to you. Enjoyed the book for coming on and talking about it.
I so appreciate you having me on, buddy. Thank you so much.